Amnesia, a machine for pigs. Chapter 1. Oswald Mandus awoke with a start, finding himself slumped in an antique armchair in a dusty study. As he tried to get his bearings, he realized he could not remember how he had gotten there, or what had happened in the last several months. His memory was a blank canvas, wiped clean. Looking around, Mandus saw he was in his mansion, but the place felt empty, abandoned. A thin layer of dust covered the furnishings. How long had he been sitting here in this chair? Where was everyone else who lived in this sprawling manor? Mandus rose on shaky legs, stumbling out of the study into the ornate hallway. He called out hesitantly, "Hello, is anyone there?" His voice echoed back at him hollowly. The mansion remained silent. Unease growing in the pit of his stomach, Mandus explored more of the darkened halls and rooms, finding no other signs of life. The grand house that once pulsed with activity now stood still, populated only by shadows. Strange sounds began to reach Mandus' ears. Creaks and moans drifted through the manor, putting him even more on edge. Turning a corner, Mandus froze. For a moment, he swore he saw a figure standing at the end of the corridor, a woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured. He blinked, and the apparition vanished. Mandus' heart pounded in his chest. What was happening here? The disturbing sounds and brief visions continued as Mandus investigated the mansion's deserted halls. He occasionally called out again for anyone who might be present, but no reply ever came. The expansive rooms and winding passages appeared completely abandoned. Increasingly desperate, Mandus finally returned to the study where he had awoken, hoping to find some clue to explain the situation. He searched the papers and books scattered on the desk by the armchair. Among geological texts and scientific notes, one word in his own handwriting jumped out at him from an old journal orb. Chapter 2. Mandus pored over the journal, seeing it was some kind of expedition log he had written. Most of the contents made little sense, scrawled frantic notes and sketches of a strange spherical artifact he called the orb. He read cryptic passages about an ancient site and tragic losses. None of it sparked any memories. He dug through more accumulated papers, looking for anything to help explain what had brought him to this state. In various notebooks and diaries, he found references to an urgent mission, using something he discovered, the orb, to construct a device that would eradicate hunger through producing biomass. Mandus read his own words with confusion and growing dread. He spoke of returning from a disastrous trip to Mexico changed and tormented, obsessed with creating a machine beneath the mansion to generate unfathomable amounts of organic matter. Recent entries devolved into deranged rants and incoherent scrawls. Disturbed, Mandus knew he had to unravel what happened here. He decided his best hope was to find the device mentioned in the journals. Perhaps seeing this machine, and the space he had built it in, would restore his memories of the last months. Taking an oil lantern from the study, Mandus steeled himself to explore the manor's cellars and underground tunnels that apparently held his creation. Descending into the gloom, Mandus entered a kitchen. Rotting food was left unfinished on countertops, ants crawling over abandoned meals. The place seemed hastily deserted, chairs still pushed out from tables. What calamity befell this house and its inhabitants? Mandus pressed onward with growing dread. Through a heavy wooden door, stone steps led down into darkness. Mandus followed them with lantern held aloft, the feeble light barely illuminating a few steps at a time. The shadows pressed in from all sides as he descended into the unknown. Chapter 3. The stone steps ended at a flooded chamber, murky water covering the floor. Mandus sloshed through tentatively, holding the lantern high. Strange machines and pipes lined the walls, caked in grime. He seemed to be in some kind of factory workspace. As he explored, Mandus noticed a putrid odor hanging in the air. He followed it around a corner to a large metal vat set into the wall. Drawing closer with the lantern, Mandus recoiled in horror. Inside, the vat was filled with rotting viscera and flesh. He stumbled back, gagging and covering his mouth. A sudden noise from the shadows made Mandus whirl around. As his light flickered over the room, for a moment he glimpsed human shapes huddled against the wall. Their haunted eyes reflected the lantern light before they disappeared. Heart pounding, Mandus fled the chamber back to the steps. He sat down halfway up the flight to collect himself. The visions grew stronger here, both unsettling sights and sounds. What were these phantoms he was seeing? They seemed connected to his erased memories somehow. With no other path available, Mandus steeled his nerves to keep exploring the flooded tunnels. Each chamber seemed more decayed than the last. Strange notes and diagrams in his handwriting covered the walls, showing machinery layouts. Ominous noises echoed through the halls, whether real or imagined Mandus could no longer tell. Passing through a crumbling archway, Mandus was assaulted by a vivid scene. The dark room was suddenly bathed in sunlight, revealing desert surroundings. Masked figures led an expedition team along ancient cliffs. At the head of the group, Mandus walked with purpose, carrying a strange metallic orb under one arm. His vision swam, and he was back in the damp underground chamber, breaths coming in gasps. The brief remembered moment stunned Mandus. Had that been Mexico, the ill-fated journey mentioned in his journal? Did that orb have some connection to his current predicament? With more questions than answers, Mandus pressed deeper into the tunnels. He prayed he would find something to explain what cursed object he had unearthed and what it had done to him. For now, the ghosts of the past remained silent. Chapter 4. Passing through converted basement workshops and storage rooms, Mandus felt he was on the brink of discovering what lay at the heart of the tunnels. Following the clues in his diary pages, he knew the machine he obsessively built must be nearby. Turning a corner, his lantern light fell across a particularly horrifying sight. Mutilated pig carcasses were strewn about the hall, rotting where they lay. Upon closer inspection, Mandus saw intricate surgical incisions and dissections, as if he had been harvesting the corpses for particular parts. His hands shook as he grasped the implications. Pressing onward, the tunnels gave way to partially collapsed halls and flooded basement levels. Clearly, some violent disaster had struck this place, breaking pipes and equipment, allowing water to rush in. Yet so far, there were no signs of human remains other than Mandus himself. What exactly had he done down here? Finally, Mandus entered a cavernous room containing a massive contraption of boilers, pipes, and machinery. Chains hung from the ceiling, some with hooks and harnesses still attached. Dark stains splattered over every surface. Though its purpose eluded him, this must be the device mentioned in his journals. His creation built to generate immense biomass and nourishment. Exploring the intricate machinery, Mandus developed a sense of how it all interconnected. But the longer he studied its workings, the more unpleasant insights formed in his mind. About the particular components needed, the fuel sources required to power such a mechanism. The flesh and organs he had always harvested from the pigs. A high-pitched whistle sounded, pulling Mandus from his increasing unease. One section of pipes had begun venting steam. To his horror, Mandus realized the device was somehow turning itself back on. Might it still be generating that mysterious biomass? What would happen if it resumed full operations once again? Mandus knew he had to shut this nightmare engine down for good. Chapter 5. Frantically searching the machine room, Mandus looked for anything to halt the rebooting process. As more steam whistled through valves, he spotted a manual override lever on one section of pipes. Gripping the rusty handle with all his strength, he forced it downward. With a groan of metal, the pipes depressurized, and the room quieted. Mandus slumped against the machinery, catching his breath. As his heart rate slowed, his mind drifted back to the visions that had haunted him since awakening in this place. He focused on the earliest one, trying to recall more details about that sunlit cliffside. If he could piece together events from Mexico, perhaps he could shed light on the present horror. In an instant, Mandus' surroundings melted away, and he stood atop the wind-swept ridges once more. He felt the orb nestle in a pack on his back. His expedition team was wary, frightened by local legends about these ruins. Only Mandus could hear the artifact's strange psychic suggestions, pushing him onward. At a carved stone doorway, the visions shifted into a blur of violence. His team was slaughtered by something that came from the ancient temple, too fast to see. In the aftermath, Mandus stood surrounded by blood and death, the orb in hand. Then the vision went dark, and Mandus found himself back in the cold subbasement. Shaken, Mandus considered the implications. Had this bizarre artifact somehow compelled him, possessed him even? Corrupted his mind to carry out its inscrutable agenda? Mandus glanced at the sprawling machinery around him. If so, he was merely the vessel for its grand design. Steeling himself, Mandus knew uncovering the orb's full influence over him was the only way to resist. He would delve deeper into his own fractured psyche if it held the answers. Gripping his lantern, Mandus turned to search for more clues to his past and wake this nightmare. Chapter 6. The lower levels of the tunnel complex appeared completely flooded, leaving Mandus to navigate via rusty catwalks and debris-choked stairs. At times, only a few inches separated the murky water from the walkways. He dreaded losing his footing in the foul liquid. Coming to a closed door, Mandus shouldered it open to reveal some kind of control room. Banks of damaged equipment lined the walls, their gauges and dials smashed. But on the largest console, a few lights still blinked, giving Mandus hope. Studying the controls, he grasped their purpose. This station oversaw the massive machine's operations. Unfortunately, most of the systems showed broken or erratic readouts. But one display still functioned, showing a representation of the machine with indicators flowing over it. To Mandus' dismay, it seemed to confirm that biomass production was slowly coming back online. If he was going to permanently deactivate the mechanism, this control hub would be the place. But the thought gave him pause. According to his journal, the machine's purpose was to nourish the impoverished masses. Should he destroy it without understanding exactly what it produced? As he pondered, Mandus noticed a weathered journal left atop the control panels. In it, he immediately recognized his own frenzied writings. As he read the most recent entry, Mandus went pale. It spoke of new heights of productivity reached, all thanks to additional biomass reservoirs he was able to tap into. Reservoirs that would yield far more nourishment than livestock alone could provide. The implications turned Mandus' stomach. He now knew the true ingredients used for this nightmare mechanism. The orb had twisted his nobler intentions into true horror. Chapter 7. Hurrying through the claustrophobic tunnels, Mandus' only thought was locating the valves to shut off the machine for good. The orb may have corrupted his mind before, but he was still in control of his actions. He would not let this abomination turn back on. Passing by the machinery's supply rooms, Mandus gazed upon the pig pens that provided grist for the mill. Just livestock at first, but he knew that had changed. Once set up, this system demanded ever more biomass, and he had provided. Mandus shuddered at what else besides pigs he had sacrificed. Emerging from the tunnels into a high-ceiling chamber, Mandus spotted a rusted ladder leading up to a precarious-looking catwalk that appeared to access the largest set of pipes feeding the machine. That must be where the central controls were located. With no other options, Mandus steeled himself to make the climb. The aged ladder creaked under his weight as he ascended carefully. Ages of moisture and decay left the structure fragile, flakes of rust falling away under his hands. Mandus tried not to imagine the long drop down should a run give way. Stepping onto the narrow catwalk, Mandus felt it sway from his motions. He kept both hands on the railing and walked slowly towards the protruding valve wheels that controlled the huge pipe's flow. Just a few more steps, and he would be able to halt the machine's rapid reboot. However, a loud clang from below startled Mandus, making him stumble. Gripping the railing to catch his balance, it shifted in his hands. Before Mandus could react, a section broke away entirely. With a cry of shock, he plunged into the abyss. Chapter 8. Mandus landed hard on a lower metal platform, knocking the wind from his lungs. Gasping, he took inventory of injuries. Bruised ribs and a gash on his forehead that bled down his face, but thankfully no broken bones. The fall could easily have killed him. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Mandus saw he was in some kind of workshop halfway down the massive chamber. The walls were lined with grubby tools and containers of machine parts. Stairways spiraled down into flooded lower levels. With no choice but to keep moving, Mandus followed the steps until he could go no further without wading into freezing, polluted waters. The orb's machine was so close, yet still out of reach. This labyrinthine complex seemed intentionally built to hide sinister secrets. Through an arched passage, Mandus entered a room that made him cry out in shock. Human corpses in various states of dissection and harvesting were piled haphazardly, parts sorted into wooden crates. Torn, blood-stained clothes told Mandus all he needed to know about these poor souls' identities. Overcome, he collapsed to his knees. Flashes of memory broke through his screams, and pleading, muffled by his hands. And an icy, rational voice in his mind explaining that more materials were required. No price was too high to achieve the greater good, it had whispered. Horrified by his own monstrous acts, Mandus wanted to scream, but no sound emerged. He had built a temple to madness, and the ancient evil made him its priest. Staring at his shaking, bloody-stained hands, Mandus knew these stains would never wash clean. Somewhere far below in the gloom, the machine thrummed on. Chapter 9. Numb with shock, Mandus knew he had to press on, keep moving or risk being consumed by anguish and revulsion at his own vile acts. He forced himself to leave the charnel workshop behind. Stepping into the next room, he lifted his lantern with hesitation. But this chamber appeared to be a simple office. Desks lay covered in architectural plans and notebooks, one wall dominated by a large chalkboard scrawled with chemical equations. Mandus searched through the papers for any useful information, trying not to imagine who might have worked here, and what subsequently became of them when the machine was fed. Inside a desk drawer, he located a leather journal packed with torn and crumpled pages. Mandus lifted it out delicately. His name was embossed on the cover in faded gold leaf. Sitting down in the musty office, Mandus started reading the pocket diary's contents by lantern light. He learned it spanned the weeks after returning from Mexico. Initial entries expressed horror and regret, speaking of violent events on the expedition and aftermath. But soon the script shifted to frantic scribblings about the orb and its revelations. Mandus read his own manic words with detachment, like dissecting a stranger's mind. Page after page detailed feverish plans for the machine, justifying it as the only possible path to perfect sustenance. He wrote of it as his life's work, an atonement. In later entries, the justifications gave way to pure madness. Graphic descriptions of supplying the mechanism made Mandus' stomach turn. By the end, the pages were stained with ominous maroon spots. Closing the journal, Mandus weighed his next steps. Stopping the machine took priority, but he hungered for the truth about the orb. That mysterious object still shadowed his mind like a half-remembered nightmare. Rising slowly, Mandus continued his descent. Chapter 10. The tunnels narrowed as Mandus walked on. Stone walls glistened with moisture, the air heavy and oppressive. He realized he was passing directly beneath the mansion now. Raising his lantern, strange cracks in the ceiling came into view. Fissure lines split the rock, seeping dirt. The deeper he delved, the more decrepit and unstable everything appeared. A spine-chilling squeal echoed from up ahead, followed by wet snorting sounds. Mandus recalled the dissected pig carcasses left to rot in the halls. Were some of the creatures still alive down here? He moved toward the noises cautiously. The passage opened up into a high-ceilinged cavern with rusty cages piled high. Most were shattered, their occupants gone. But a few intact pens held living pigs, covered in grotesque tumors and growths. They writhed in the filth, squealing in distress at Mandus' presence. He stared at the mutated animals with pity and revulsion. Kneeling to examine one pig's horrific lesions, understanding dawned on Mandus. The orb's influence poisoned everything it touched, twisting living flesh, just as it had twisted his psyche. These pens must have supplied the earliest fodder before he found less wholesome sources. That thought sent his mind reeling back. Mandus grasped the cell bars to steady himself as vivid memories flooded forth, no longer suppressed. He saw himself moving through the mansion in a hollow stupor, stalking silhouettes just out of sight. Sounds of struggle rang out, along with screams cut horribly short. The vision centered on 3 figures, his wife and 2 young sons. Mandus recalled their pleading cries and desperate, tear-filled eyes as he dragged them below ground. But at the time, he felt only cold purpose. The machine required more. He watched his body haul the bloodied, motionless corpses to the grafting workshop, lying them out on slabs, taking up gleaming tools without hesitation, methodically stripping away flesh and sawing bone. Nothing mattered but sustaining the endless hunger below. The memories released Mandus, and he collapsed in anguish. He had slaughtered his own family to feed his monstrous delusion. The truth racked his soul. All traces of the loving husband and father he once was had been consumed by the infernal creation the orb inspired. It had turned him into a hollow vessel through which to work its unfathomable will. Overwhelmed with grief and self-loathing, Mandus wanted the memory to end. But he forced himself to keep living it, to etch every gruesome detail into his mind. It was justice for what he had done, what he had become. Weeping bitterly, Mandus pushed onward into the depths. Chapter 11. Passing through the mutation-racked pens, Mandus entered a region clearly near the machine's core. Pistons pounded, boilers steamed, and pipes groaned under extreme pressure. Compared to the decay and silence in other areas, this section buzzed with activity. Along one wall ran a glass tube as wide around as a tree trunk. It was filled with viscous, oozing black fluid that pulsed and churned as if alive. Mandus watched in disgust and alarm as the vile substance flowed steadily onward to feed the hidden machine heart. Up ahead, the service tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Staring out over a railing, Mandus beheld the massive contraption in full operation. He gazed upon his creation with horror and awe. All around him, the orbital shell revolved, blended and separated organic matter on a nightmarish scale. From drainage vats set below the machine, the same tarry black sludge poured forth into collecting tanks. The occasional bone or gristle was caught in the muck. This was the hellish bounty his mechanism produced, matter decomposed past recognition, then reconstituted. Suddenly, the entire chamber shook. Metal platforms buckled and creaked under the strain. The machine whined in protest like a living thing. Mandus braced himself as debris rained down around him. This cursed place was breaking apart, and would take him with it soon. He had to escape. First, he needed to sabotage the reboot sequence before this abomination could complete a full production cycle. Gritting his teeth with determination, Mandus set off to find the central control hub. He would shut down the machine's black heart, no matter the cost. Chapter 12. Reaching a spiral staircase, Mandus rushed down the steps as the tunnel continued to buckle. The metal edges of stairs sliced his hands as he gripped them tightly. He could hear rushing water somewhere below, growing louder by the second. At the bottom, Mandus stopped short in dismay. A concrete dam, designed to hold back endless gallons of wastewater, had ruptured, and a foaming wall of filth was barreling towards him. Turning back, he saw the staircase already submerged by several feet of rising water. Wading into the torrent, Mandus fought his way across the corridor. The force pummeled him like a battering ram, threatening to pull him under. At last, his hand grasped a half-open doorway, and he hauled himself through by sheer strength. Slamming the door closed behind him, Mandus collapsed in a drainage tunnel, chest heaving. All routes back were cut off now. His only hope was going forward, finding some other way around. Steeling himself, Mandus sloshed down the cramped tunnel. He soon arrived at a hub chamber, its multiple tunnels emanating outwards like spokes. One passage ahead glowed with faint light. Gratefully moving toward it, Mandus froze as an ear-splitting metallic screech filled the space. Looking up in horror, he saw the ceiling tearing loose. Mandus dove backwards into the murk just as tons of rock and machinery crashed down, sealing off the tunnel completely. The rubble left no way forward or back. He was trapped deep in the belly of the beast. Chapter 13. Coughing through clouds of dust, Mandus searched desperately for some way through the wall of debris. But the rock and twisted metal completely choked off the tunnel ahead. Turning back to the hub chamber, his heart sank. All the other spokes were flooded by the rising wastewater. Tentatively, Mandus stepped into the foul liquid. But the water quickly rose to his chest, and the current dragged at his body. He would be pulled down and drowned if he tried to follow the flooded passages. There had to be another option. Mandus sloshed back to the rubble blockade and inspected it from all angles. Finding a small gap between twisted girders, he pulled out a length of pipe wedged in the debris. Working it back and forth, the hole widened slightly. Hopeful, Mandus pressed his face into the opening for a better view. Beyond, he glimpsed a large room still intact, its lights miraculously still on. Mandus maneuvered the pipe vigorously, straining to shove chunks of concrete aside and expand the hole. With a final heave, it opened enough to squeeze through. Clambering over razor-sharp metal, Mandus tore his clothes and scraped his arms. But he managed to crawl through the gap into the lit chamber. Catching his breath, he was relieved to find a functioning stairway along one wall, leading up out of the flood. Ascending cautiously, Mandus prayed the steps led to an exit route. This nightmare had already taken so much from him, his memories, sanity, loved ones. He could not let it claim his life as well. Jaw set, Mandus climbed onward, striving for the surface. Chapter 14. The stairs ended at a secure metal door that, when heaved open, revealed blinding sunlight. Shielding his eyes, Mandus stumbled out onto soft grass in a small courtyard beside the mansion. Gasping the fresh air greedily, he had made it out alive. As his vision adjusted, Mandus took in the manor's ivy-covered facade. Was this familiar home still as abandoned inside as the underground tunnels? He had to know if anyone else survived. Approaching cautiously, Mandus entered through a side door. The kitchen appeared untouched, morning light streaming in the windows. He moved from room to room, finding no signs of life, everything coated under a fine layer of undisturbed dust. Just as before, he was alone here. Reaching the grand foyer, movement at the top of the stairs made Mandus freeze. A human shape flickered there for an instant before vanishing. Gripping a fireplace poker, Mandus raced up the steps and down the hall after it. "Wait, please, I mean no harm," he cried out. Rounding a corner, Mandus swung the poker through thin air. There was no one, just his tormented mind playing tricks again. Defeated, he slumped against the wall and slid to the floor. A familiar voice spoke in his mind. "Do not resist, Oswald. You cannot fight what's already within." Mandus' blood turned to ice, realizing with dread that the orb was still with him, its presence lurking in his psyche. Would it never release him from its grasp? Chapter 15. Fleeing the echoing voice in his head, Mandus retreated to the mansion's dusty library. Rows of leather-bound books provided little comfort. He sat staring blankly, the orb's last taunt repeating in his mind. Part of Mandus yearned to embrace the entity's call, if only to end this tortured existence weighted by remorse. But he knew succumbing would only spread more evil. Somehow, he had to purge its infectious whispers from his soul. Venturing out again, Mandus searched rooms aimlessly, as if he might stumble upon an answer. Turning down cramped servant stairs, he discovered narrow chambers that sparked his interest. The bedrooms contained strange curios artifacts that must have come from the Mexico expedition. Handling one item's Mandus' mind was assaulted by a vivid vision. He stood over a dig site in a desert valley, levering a smooth orb from the red rock. The same voice he now knew as the orb proclaimed that he had succeeded. Dropping the relic, Mandus fell back, gasping. Was this memory from when he first unearthed that cursed object? He shivered, imagining its dark energy suffusing his hands as he pulled it into the light. If only he had known then what was to come. Leaving the vision behind, Mandus crept back upstairs. He had found the cause, uncovered the source. Now he needed a cure for the orb's infection. But would one ever be found wandering these empty halls? The answer waited below, in flooded tunnels that had nearly claimed his life. To destroy the evil within, he must return to its heart of darkness one last time. Chapter 16. Approaching the tunnel entrance cautiously, Mandus steeled himself to descend once more. His first steps splashed into inches of water. The flooding continued, slowly rising. There was no time to waste. Instead of retracing his nightmarish path through the machine's bowels directly, Mandus searched for maintenance routes along its periphery. Crumbling stairways brought him down through careful shortcuts until he found what he sought, the central control junction. The massive chamber still shook, the machine's increasing instability threatening to tear itself apart. Standing on the elevated control platform, Mandus observed the network of pipes feeding the orb's creation. Each supply line was controlled by a large valve. Starting with those originating from the deepest charnel pits, Mandus closed off the valves one by one. With each turn of a rusted wheel, he felt as if he turned off part of his own defiled mind. The pipes emptied out, the flow of meat and bones staunched. Approaching the final and largest pipe, Mandus steeled himself before gripping the valve's wheel. As he strained to budge it, oily liquid gushed from around the seals. The voice echoed once more. "This is your life's work, Oswald. Are you certain you wish to destroy it?" Ignoring the doubts, Mandus roared with effort. The valve shuddered, then slowly pulled shut with a deafening clang. The orb's machine went silent. He had won. Chapter 17. Mandus slumped in exhaustion, but was jarred by an ear-splitting boom from deep below. All around, the facility began to buckle and implode. He had to get out fast. Racing up crumbling stairs towards distant daylight, the air grew choked with dust. Adrenaline pushed Mandus through corridors, vibrating violently, ceiling beams crashing down inches behind his heels. Bursting out of a side door, Mandus flew face first into overgrown gardens. Rolling over on the mossy stones, he stared up at a sky just visible through the ivy-draped walls. The fresh air had never smelled sweeter. As the rumbling subsided, Mandus became aware of soft crying. Pulling himself to his feet, he followed the anguished sound to a storm cellar door. Wrenching it open released more dust, and faint illumination revealed a huddled figure at the bottom of the steps. "Hello!" Mandus spoke gently so as not to startle the person. "I mean you no harm." The figure turned, and Mandus looked upon the face of his son, Edwin. The boy rushed into his father's arms. "I knew you would come," Edwin whispered. Overcome with relief, Mandus led the boy outside. As Edwin clung to him, Mandus swore that he would never let anything threaten this innocent child again. He had slain a great evil today, but now knew an even greater good awaited. Chapter 18. Reunited with Edwin, Mandus wished to flee the mansion and begin life anew with his son. But the boy refused to leave the grounds, insisting his pets were trapped below when the disaster struck. Though wary of anything still alive down there, Mandus yielded to Edwin's pleas. Descending the cellar steps, Mandus kept Edwin behind him. The air had cleared, but debris still smoldered from the implosion. They picked their way through shattered stone cautiously. In a crumbled antechamber lay a squirming burlap sack. Edwin rushed forward to scoop it up. "You found them," he exclaimed joyfully. From inside sounded squeaks and scratching. "Pets?" Mandus asked. "What manner of animals do you?" He was cut off as Edwin opened the sack, releasing not cats or hounds, but a dozen albino rats. Before Mandus could react, the rodent swarmed over Edwin, crawling into his clothes and ears. The boy's demeanor changed. "You disappoint me, father," Edwin spoke with a chilling voice. "Did you truly think you could destroy my creation without consequence?" Then Mandus understood. The orb had taken refuge in his only surviving son. "Leave the boy's body and return to hell where you belong," Mandus commanded. Edwin merely smiled. "This mortal shell suits my purposes well enough. The machine you broke was but one vessel to spread salvation across your world. Now I have another." Overcome with despair, Mandus sank to his knees. Chapter 19. Now, father, there's no need for hysterics," said Edwin in the orb's mocking tones as Mandus wept bitterly. "We shall bring a great new era to mankind together." Composing himself, Mandus replied carefully. "You corrupted me once already, demon. I will not become your obedient puppet again." Edwin regarded him with cold eyes. "Who said anything about obedience? I have no more need for your limited faculties." The boy turned and gestured to the scurrying rats now crawling all over the debris-strewn floor. "These shall be the vehicles of my new design, infesting your great cities, spreading purification." A rat leapt at Mandus' face, but he caught it and snapped its neck. More angry squeaks came from Edwin's clothes. The boy stared, no longer smiling. "You distance yourself from me, yet we both know you only delay the inevitable." Edwin leaned in close. "This place, these events, they will mock your soul forever." Much as Mandus wanted to run, he forced himself to turn and meet the child's gaze directly. "You know nothing of the soul's resilience. I have seen hell already, but now hope yet remains." Edwin's eyes narrowed, uncertainty flickering across his face. In that moment of hesitation, Mandus scooped up a loose brick and struck Edwin hard across the temple. The boy collapsed unconscious. Unsure if it was too late, Mandus prayed frantically as he carried Edwin's limp body up into the light. Chapter 20. Edwin awoke in his own bed to find his father slumped asleep in a chair beside him. For a moment, the boy couldn't recall how he got here. Then memories flooded back, the voice whispering in his mind, the creatures crawling under his skin. Repressing a shudder, Edwin shook his father's shoulder gently. Mandus jerked awake, relief washing over his face. "You're back, you're still in there, my boy." He embraced Edwin tearfully. "Father, I'm so sorry," Edwin murmured. Mandus quieted him, simply grateful to hear his true voice again, untainted by the demon. Together, they abandoned the cursed mansion. As their coach drove off, the manor receded in the distance until obscured by rolling fog. Mandus watched its fading silhouette, allowing himself to hope again. But what of the orb itself? Had it only retreated deeper into the darkness below? For Edwin's sake, Mandus prayed they had escaped its reach for good. Inside the crumbling ruin, tendrils of inky black slime crept through cracks and along pipes. Dripping down through grates, the writhing mass spilled into one of countless tunnels winding their way beneath London's dense streets. It oozed onward hungrily, called toward the distant heart of the world's greatest metropolis. Deep under the crowded city, tiny shapes with milky eyes and quivering snouts tasted the air as the viscous tide seeped into their cavernous burrows. Their excited squeals echoed through miles of lightless tunnels as the horde rippled out, hungry to infect, consume, multiply. And,